Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining today. This is Confidently Present Your Qualitative Results chapter. My name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. We do offer full service dissertation editing and consulting services and provide assistance to doctoral students on research that is both qualitative and quantitative, from topic development all the way to the defense. So we have qualitative mentors, quantitative mentors, and research mentors on staff to assist with any stage of the process. This webinar today is going to be on presenting your qualitative chapter. We also have other webinars available, which you can view on our website. We've got Sierra on the call today, and she's posted some links in the chat to refer you to those resources. So if you're interested, please do check those out. But we will go ahead and get started with the webinar. So here is a list of the different sections that we've seen covered, pretty standard in the dissertation in the qualitative results chapter. The one thing I will say before we start is that if you are able to access a template or a checklist from your department or your chair, it's best to try to get your hands on that before you start writing, because that will be a good roadmap for where you should be going as you start to pull your chapter together. But if you don't have access to something like that, this list is a pretty good start. It's pretty comprehensive of what you will want to include in your chapter. So you'll start off the chapter with your introduction. This is where you will restate the problem and the purpose of your study. It's important to note that when you're restating the problem and the purpose, you should make sure it's verbatim, as it's been stated throughout the other chapters in your dissertation that you've already written. This is because we just want to make sure that you're providing a very consistent and clear picture for the reader. So make sure that each time that you use problem or purpose statements, they are written exactly the same. This way, there's no ambiguity or change in meaning as the reader goes through your paper. Next, you'll want to remind the reader of your research questions. So same thing here, you want to make sure that those research questions are written verbatim. It may begin to feel redundant, but it's just to provide clarity. So it's totally fine if you're copying and pasting the same language. It's just going to help the reader as they go through know exactly what you're talking about. And then once you've done both of those things, you can provide an overview of what you'll be presenting in the chapter. You can do this using the headings that you plan to use, like setting, demographics, just to give the reader a brief preview of what they'll be getting into as they go through the chapter. So the setting is going to be about where you've conducted your research. I like to think about this as, what do your readers need to know in order to be able to understand the results and understand the interpretation of the results. So thinking about what is the context that they'll need in order to understand these. So any conclusions that might have impacted your research or influences that may have influenced your research or your participants, you'll want to discuss those in depth here. You'll also want to talk about anything that may have impacted the interpretation of your results. So if you think back to your methods chapter, you've probably already talked about and established the setting for your study. But if you think about your proposal, it's probably was written kind of in the context of an ideal world, right? It's exactly the study that you want to conduct. It's the idea that you have. But once you get through data collection and data analysis, there may have been some things that changed. So here you'll just want to talk about how your setting has changed and what conditions may have influenced your research, your participants, or impacted your results. Next, you will get into the demographics of your study. So here you'll want to talk about any information or characteristics about your participants that are important to the setting and your study. So again, you'll want to establish the context for your research and your results. So you'll do this by thinking about the type of study that you're conducting and what particular characteristics may be important for your reader to know. So for example, if you're doing a study on professional development among teachers, it may be helpful for your reader to know how long those participants have been teachers, how long they've worked at a particular organization, different things like this that really relate to your research question. Another example, if you're doing a study regarding the experience of homelessness among youth, it may be important to provide an average or a standard deviation of the amount of years that your participants have been homeless. So just really thinking about what those characteristics are that are relevant to your study and ensuring that you're reporting them here. You could do this in a table or as a narrative. If you choose to do a narrative, I recommend doing maybe a profile on each participant. Regardless of how you present this data, the main thing is that you're thinking about and being cognizant of maintaining the participant's confidentiality. So if you do choose to do a table, think about ways that you can kind of obscure the data so that if someone is reading it, they're not able to identify participants based on what you've entered in the table. So an example of this might be if you have maybe 5 participants or 10 participants and you're reporting their graduation year. Instead of putting the exact year, you might want to report a range. So maybe say 2000 to 2002. This way, if someone's reading it, they're not aligning particular characteristics and able to identify your participants. The same thing could be helpful if you're reporting ages. It may be better to report an age range just to make sure that you're maintaining that confidentiality and protecting those who participated in your study. So you'll also present your results on data collection. So again, thinking back to the proposal, you've already outlined really clearly how you would collect data in the methods chapter. But now that you've already collected it, you just need to write and explain to your reader what actually happened during the data collection process. So here you'll be reporting any deviation from what you've already proposed in your methods. You'll talk about how many participants you collected data from, the frequency, the location, how you recorded the data, and also detail any variations from the plan that you initially had in place. Just to get into some specifics here, when you're talking about how you recorded the data, you want to very clearly talk about what type of software you used. So maybe if you're doing a quantitative study and participants filled out a survey, maybe you used RedCap or SurveyMonkey, whatever it may be, you'll just want to talk about that. And then you'll also want to talk about how the data was stored and how it was handled. So ensuring, again, confidentiality among your participants. Was this data de-identified? You'll just want to really outline each of these things for the reader. And then getting back to that element on variations, one example of this might be, for example, if you in your prospectus described that you intended to collect data in person, but then had to change your method due to the pandemic. Maybe you were only able to do virtual data collection. This is the section where you would address that. And you would also want to talk about the potential impact that that had on your results. So not just talking about what the change is, but what the implications are for your study. In your data analysis section, you'll detail how you will apply your plan for data analysis that you've already described, how you took your data, first broke it down into codes, and then started to build it up into categories and eventually themes. So you're going to talk about your plan, and here also just being very clear and providing a step-by-step description, almost like an instruction manual of how you coded passages and why you coded them a specific way. So basically, you're going to be moving through from that coding process all the way to categories and then to themes. This is also where you're going to describe any discrepant cases that might have risen in your data. So discrepant cases are when someone deviates from the patterns. So if you are conducting a qualitative study, maybe you're doing interviews with participants, it's unlikely that every single participant will describe the exact same experience. So if you have one participant who differs, you'll just want to talk about that here. It's important to note that when we are using qualitative data, you don't want to kind of just discount those discrepant cases. You really want to describe their experience and talk about why it might be different from others or where it differs. So here you'll talk about how you handled that during the analysis process. Next, we're going to talk about organizing your results section. So the results can be organized in a few different ways. The decisions that you make for this presentation are really dependent on what's most appropriate for your study and what you can defend. So it might make sense to organize your results by research question, or it may make sense to do it by category or theme. In general, I always recommend defaulting to whatever way your school requests that you do it, but it really just takes some thinking and looking at the themes that you have and seeing if there's any specific way that makes the most sense. Personally, I like to report results by theme. I find it easier to provide illustrative quotes sectioned by theme and really just talk about that experience in that way as opposed to research question. But again, it is a personal choice just based on what your study calls for. And then for the presentation of data, so for qualitative studies, you should mostly be using your own words. You will include supporting quotes from participants. And if you conducted maybe a document analysis or any observations, you can also include excerpts from documents or photographs where it's appropriate if you used observations. But for the most part, you should really be using your own words. So you'll discuss your data and interpret it where appropriate. Now I say where appropriate because there are multiple qualitative designs and not all of them allow for interpretation in this section in the results chapter. There are a couple of research designs that are looking for that in the discussion where you'll discuss and then interpret the data. So depending on the design you're using, you'll want to interpret those findings here in the presentation of data, but just be aware that it also may be in the discussion. Otherwise, the discussion will come next. And again, you'll be presenting your data and your results. You just want to think about presenting it in a logical and clear way for the reader. So you're kind of holding their hand through this process, breaking down from codes to categories to themes, and then really giving some explanation as to what these themes mean in relation to your research questions. So as I mentioned, the discrepant cases are those that don't match the patterns that you're seeing in your data. Again, we don't want to omit these because they provide alternate explanations and illustrate variations in experience. So really just highlighting that everyone experiences things differently. So any of the discrepant cases, you would want to discuss them within the context of whatever the pattern or theme is. So you don't want to kind of have an overarching paragraph for discrepancies. You want to make sure to insert those where the discrepancies happen. So if you are reporting by theme, talk about that under the theme as opposed to just a general area in your paper. As for visualizing your findings, you can absolutely use methods to visualize your findings like tables, figures, maps, or drawings. Any of these might be appropriate. I think a good rule of thumb is to use them sparingly and to really determine if they're going to be contributing to the reader's understanding. And if the answer is yes, then they're great to include. But if it doesn't really seem to add value, then it's a safe bet that you can leave it out. When you do choose to use any type of figure or table, It's important to make sure that you are describing that table and providing context for it. So you want to make sure that your reader doesn't kind of happen upon a table in an abrupt fashion without any context. You want to make sure that you are providing a narrative description. It doesn't necessarily have to be a long description, but there just should be some information on what that table contains and how it relates to your study. Next, you will probably need to discuss the trustworthiness of your results. So this is also something that you've probably included in your methods chapter. So here you will be talking about the 4 tenets of your chapter. So the credibility, the transferability, dependability, and the confirmability. And this is just to show the reader that these results are valid, they're consistent, they can be replicated, and really just providing some information about your study that gives the reader confidence in these results. So you'll want to talk about how you establish trustworthiness in your study, which is something that you've, again, probably outlined in your method. So if you're stuck, you can always look back and see what you intended to do and kind of report back if you did that, or you can talk about anything, any additional measures you took to establish trustworthiness. Some ways that you might discuss are things like member checking to establish confirmability and maybe even credibility. So member checking has to do with once you have your results, just giving a brief summary of your results to your participants and having a conversation with them about what they think about if your results accurately reflect their experience. So here again, you want to talk about any ways that you deviated from your plan. So if member checking is something that you intended on doing, but maybe when it came down to it, you weren't able to get back in contact with your participants, you'll just want to describe that here to let the reader know that, there were some changes in your methods, and you will want to talk about what other measures you took to make sure you're still establishing that trustworthiness in the absence of previous methods that you may have used. And then you will finish off your chapter with a summary section. So the best way to think of the summary is if someone only has time to read the summary, what are the key points that they need to take away? So you'll want to highlight the findings, really just paint a picture for the reader of what the key points of your analysis were. And then you'll want to provide some transition statements to lead into the discussion chapter and to preview what's to come in your discussion chapter. Now, before we end, I will provide a few tips about writing the section. So I know one struggle when you come to the results is that you might have a lot of data, you may have a lot of coded data that you just don't know what to do with. I always recommend starting kind of just where you can. So although I've presented today each section kind of in order, there is no rule as to where you need to start. So if maybe you're having a day where it's difficult to write, I always recommend starting with your demographics table, because no matter what, you're going to need it, and it's kind of an easier section to get done. So really kind of reaching for that low-hanging fruit. So demographics, setting, trustworthiness, some of those areas that are just a little bit easier to write, those are good places to start. Also, if there are any particular themes that have arisen in your data that you feel confident about or passionate about, that's a great place to start as well. So just emphasizing that there's no particular order that you need to get these things done. And even if you can just start in one place and then maybe move backwards, it'll continue to move you forwards in the overall chapter. So it's okay to go out of order. Another recommendation I always have is free writing. So I think, a lot of times students try to gravitate towards making sure they're writing a perfect paragraph or a perfect section. But sometimes it's not always realistic. So if you can free write for 10 to 15 minutes a day, just completely brain dumping, don't censor your writing, just write about your results. It will help really generate ideas for this section. So it's okay to kind of use that method and then go back and clean up what you have. You may generate some really key points that can be incorporated into your results, even though they're not perfect at that first free write. So that's one thing to consider, just taking some time. It may have been, when you get to this point, it may be a while. It may have been a while since you've written your prospectus, so you may be out of practice. So just taking that time to free write can be very, very helpful. But I will open up the floor for questions. So if you have any, please feel free to pop them in the chat or in the Q&A box. We do have a lot of different webinars available on our website, and Sierra's posted the link in the chat. So if you are looking for discussion help, introduction help, literature search, whatever it is, please do feel free to check those out as well. And if there are no questions, I just want to thank you all for joining today. You will receive a copy of the slides. Thank you, Kathleen. I hope you have a great day. You all will receive a copy of the slides and the recording for your reference. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We do offer a free 30-minute consultation. So if there's any area that you're struggling with, Janine, she's great. She can help you figure out where we can best support, or direct you to any resources that we have on our website. All right. Thank you. Have a great day.